So we've been talking a lot here at Penn about developing and identifying high potentials, and the second part of this title is really key, that can drive your business strategy. So one of the key issues we've noted is potential for what? It's really difficult to identify high potentials when you're not measuring a potential for what. So this driving business strategy is the key part of both identifying and developing high potentials, and the topic of today's discussion. So my name is Christy Smith, or Christy Panico. We're also getting used to my new name here at Penn. I am the assessment manager, and I oversee our assessor team as well as our reseller partners accounts. Joining me is Dr. Martin Lanik. Martin, I'll turn it over to you to do an introduction. Martin is the CEO and founder of Penn.
Thank you, Christy. So I'm Martin Lanik. I'm an industrial organizational psychologist and CEO of Penn. I have a pleasure of working with talented people like Christy around the world, and we deliver at Penn. We deliver assessment and development solutions for many high potential programs. So over the years, we have touched about 3,000 different leaders who have went through our programs at organizations like Coca-Cola or Deutsche Telekom or Denver Health, and our solutions are run in multiple languages, and you can see at the bottom of the slide.
Great, thank you, Martin. So a few logistics before we dive into the content for today. There's two ways, if you have questions, that we encourage you to ask those questions. The first is you can raise your hand, and then we can unmute you, and you're welcome to ask your question live. Or you can also put your question in the chat box. I'll be monitoring that and asking throughout the presentation as we go. So feel free to jump in with questions at any time. So there's many different reasons, I'm sure, that you are interested in investing high potentials. And really any of these reasons is enough to drive that investment. But the reality for many is that they're facing more than one of these issues, resulting in an even greater urgency for investing in high potentials. So the first reason we commonly see is to support growth. This is, of course, always a good problem to have, but it is a good problem in the sense that with growth comes other considerations, such as who will be the next leaders. So investing in high potentials becomes critical for supporting that growth. The second is labor shortages. I was recently reading an article about a bunch of tech companies that had moved to Colorado because they felt there was a greater talent pool in Colorado. And so for many of us, picking up and moving our company is not really an option. We need to figure out a different way to address some of these labor shortages, and investing in high potentials can be a great way to do that. The third is retiring executives, or the baby boomers. Most of us are probably starting to feel the effects of the retiring baby boomer generation, but really this is coming in the next couple of years. We'll see the most significant effect over the next couple of years. So now is really a great time to start investing in those high potentials. And then finally is engagement and retention of team members. So the research suggests that even if someone's not selected for a promotion, even if they're not selected for a high potential program, that even just seeing that others are selected and given the opportunity to advance in the organization is motivational engaging. And certainly it's motivational and engaging for those individuals that are selected for development and for that investment. So all of these reasons may be why you're joining us here today, and we'll talk through now some of the different reasons that, or some of the different ways that we can go through developing and identifying high potential.
These are some great points, Christy, and I think in a lot of organizations what I'm seeing is that, as you mentioned, it's a combination of these problems. And more and more we used to think about high potential programs as really developing people for executive positions, but now we're seeing more high potential programs at the different levels of leadership. So high potential program for a frontline leader or manager, such as in nursing, or mid-level leaders. As organizations are trying to fill their leadership pipeline, there are different high potential programs at different levels of leadership, more or less addressing a combination of these problems.
Great, thank you for that addition. We did have a question about developing high potentials at different levels, and so we can speak to that a little bit more in the presentation as well. So before we dive into more of the meat of identifying and developing high potentials, I'd like to take a step back and look at the big picture, our big picture goal here, and what companies are really trying to accomplish with high potential identification and development. So the goal is oftentimes to mitigate the risk of poor leadership. So research suggests that the risk of having poor leadership is around 1.2 million in losses when considering the impact of leadership to the company bottom line, and that the investment that most companies are putting into high potentials is around $7,116. So when it looks at it in this way, it seems that this is a really great investment. There's a lot of risk to be mitigated with a relatively small investment to put forward. So of course this is something that we would want to do. High potential development, based on these figures, seems quite warranted.
Yeah, and this number, that 1.2 million in losses, that actually reflects one bad leader or one bad executive in the organization. So when you look at the bottom line impact of bad executives, in this particular study showed that a single bad executive can result on average in $1.2 million in losses for the organization. At the same time, as Christy mentioned, so that investment of $7,116 that on average organizations spent per high potential per year just doesn't seem as such a big investment.
So now we'll turn to what companies are using, what types of methods they're using to select and to develop high potential employees. So here we have both the frequency of use and then the perceived effectiveness of these various approaches. So frequency of use, we can see that mentoring, personal assessments are very high up there. Actually, all of these methods are used rather frequently, suggesting that most companies are using some combination of approach. And then if we look at the perceived effectiveness of these approaches, we can see that where we're putting our effort is not always where we're seeing the most effectiveness or the perceived effectiveness. However, with that said, there is still a very high perceived effectiveness of these various different approaches. So given the multi-pronged approach that most companies seem to be taking and the perceived effectiveness of these various different approaches, the question becomes, why isn't high potential development more successful? So what issues are maybe getting in the way?
Yeah, and when I look at this graph, and just judging from the high potential programs that I've seen out there, they all look the same. So there's little variation. There's some workshops, some assessments, some coaching, stretch assignments, and so forth, and maybe action learning. So more or less, all the high potential programs look the same. Interestingly enough, it seems like there is also a correlation or relationship between the effectiveness and the investment. So look at coaching. So probably the most expensive, and then leadership training. So the most expensive interventions also tend to be most effective, which hopefully makes sense. As we're spending more money, we would like to get higher ROI on these interventions.
Unfortunately, however, we're not really seeing that ROI. So when we look at the percentage of HR leaders that see the programs holistically as effective, we can see here that roughly 25% or so are perceiving those programs as holistically effective, leaving 77% that are seeing this as either marginally effective or completely ineffective, which is a very large percentage given the amount of investment that we're putting into high potentials in terms of the financial investment as well as the time that we're putting into high potential development.
So this is really at Pinside what we try to dig deeper into. So why is it that the individual interventions are more or less effective, but when we put them together into a high potential program, we're not getting the ROI and they are not functioning well. So I'll walk you through an example here. So this is on average what happens in an organization, and I'm going to be using that number of $7,116 as the annual investment per high potential employee. So let's say that you start each year with a new cohort or a new group of high potentials, and just for the sake of simplicity for this example, let's just say that you have 100 of them. So in January you start a new group, you have 100 high potentials that you're investing in developing. So research shows that about 12% of them are going to drop out before the program is over. So they will never finish this program. So when you then multiply 12 by 7,112, that's the average investment in a single high potential, there is a loss of $85,000 right there. So these folks will never become effective leaders because they never finish the program. Also, about 40% of your high potentials, maybe they finish the program, and they will be promoted, but they'll actually fail. So that's an additional investment of $284,000 that just went out of the window. And here's the interesting part. So we think about high potential program as really an engagement and retention strategy, but research shows that 33% of your high potentials are actively seeking other employment while they are in the high potential program itself. So that's another $234,000 of wasted resources because these individuals will never make it and they're likely get an offer from your competitor. So when we add this together, 84% of your high potentials that you started with in the beginning of the year are not going to become successful executives. So that's $600,000 of wasted resources right there. And again, I arrived at this number by simply multiplying the percentages here with the average investment in high potentials. So at the end of the year, only 15% of your high potentials that you started with can potentially become successful executives. So then when we think about kind of what is the true investment in a single high potential, initially we think that we are only investing $7,116 in a single high potential, but because we are only ending up with 15% of them being successful, the true investment in this, with all the ones that drop out, that leave the organization, or that are promoted and fail, the true investment in a high potential per year then on average would be $47,440. So this is quite a big difference between what we think we're investing in the high potential and what truly ends up happening. And we pinpointed two areas where the problem really is. The first one is in the selection. So we don't have the right people in there. We know that the interventions work, but they only work on the right people. So if you don't start with the right group of high potentials, then all the money that you spend on their development, all the coaching, stretch assignments, action learning, or leadership training, that all gets wasted because you don't start with the right people in the beginning. And then the second point is that the programs are not always tailored to the individual needs of your high potentials. So companies still take a spray and pray approach with classes where they put everybody through the same curriculum and they hope that something sticks. And they end up putting people through classes and workshops and on competencies and skills that the high potentials already do possess. So when we look deeper, so this is a very interesting study done by Center for Creative Leadership. So when we actually ask people who have been identified in the organization as high potentials, do you see yourself as a high potential? Generally, on average, 36% of people who are currently in your high potential program would not even identify themselves as high potentials. So this tells me that there is a big problem with how we are selecting them. So we then turn to some research on what are the most common ways how organizations select high potentials. And it turns out that there are three most frequent ways how high potentials are selected. The first one is performance appraisals, and they are by far the most common way to select high potentials. So whether you use some kind of a talent management software where these manager ratings of performance and potential are then entered into a 9-box grid, but they're still coming from the managers. Or there is simply some sort of a manager nomination program. So managers identify 2-3 superstars on their team and they flag them as high potentials. Notice that assessments are used infrequently, so only 10% or less than 10% actually of organizations use assessments to identify high potentials. Now let's compare that with the effectiveness of these tools. So how effective are performance appraisals or manager nominations compared to assessments in identifying who will be a successful high potential? Look at this huge difference. So manager nominations by far are the worst, and we know that. There are plenty of books on this and plenty of literature suggesting that managers are very bad at identifying potential of their employees. Performance appraisals a little better, but look at assessments. So when organizations implement assessments, they get a much higher success rate of identifying the right people for a high potential program. So this is quite, I find this always quite fascinating. Christy, what have you seen out there as far as high potential selection?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, Martin. So we were just speaking actually recently with a client that was talking about this high potential identification, and she had suggested that in a lot of organizations it's really a popularity contest, wherein we see individuals being selected that are kind of the golden child or that are the most liked in the organization. And just because individuals are of course the most liked doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be the best leaders. So I think that may explain why we see the effectiveness of the performance appraisals and the manager nominations. Certainly those are both areas where that popularity contest or those organizational politics can have a huge influence on who's being selected, and it's a factor that's really irrelevant necessarily for performance as a high potential or as a leader.
Yeah, and I also find in many organizations these decisions are just so political, and then on top of it, when the organization is not being transparent about who high potentials are, this can have some negative effects, because people don't even know why they are being selected for a program or why they are required to go through a particular training. So in those cases, it might even seem like punitive measure, that you are not a good leader, so therefore you have to go through this high potential program. But of course they wouldn't let those leaders know that they're going through a high potential program.
Right, and I think that would really align with the 36% you presented previously that don't identify themselves in that way and are still in a high potential program.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so where do we go from here, and then how do we address these issues? So one of the interventions that we found quite useful is to implement an assessment after nomination. So I would see that as a first step that still balances. You want the buy-in from managers, and you want them to have a say in who is nominated for a high potential program for political reasons in the organization and fairness perceptions, and then just general buy-in of the program. But what we recommend is putting an assessment right after the nominations. And this assessment will then help you categorize the nominated individuals. And we tend to work with 4 tracks, so we find that quite useful. And based on these 4 tracks, you can create as if different high potential programs, but that you are tailoring to the individual needs of those folks who have been nominated. So you might find that some folks are ready now. So based on the assessment, they have all the skills necessary to move up to a mid-level position or a frontline leadership position. So these folks will require different type of intervention than individuals who are ready in 6 months. So these individuals who are ready in 6 months, those are your true high potential. So these are the folks that have the potential to develop and grow the quickest. Then you might have another track that is more longer term, and that's going to be a high potential program that's going to be taking 12 months, and then you would have folks that are just not fit for a high potential program, and we generally recommend send them back to their manager, have them develop or have them put together a development plan. Give them some special assignments maybe in their current position, expand their current position, and encourage them to apply to the program again next year. Now what we find very often, especially when you implement simulation-based assessments where the leader or the individual contributor gets the opportunity to experience what the role is like at the next level, we find that some automatically select themselves out. And this goes back to the 36% of folks who don't really want the job. They maybe want the status and the higher income that is associated with the promotion, but they're not a good fit for the job itself. So they're not going to be an effective mid-level leader. Or even with individual contributors, people think that they want to manage oftentimes, but until you give them a realistic job preview, they cannot really understand what the job is about. So we always find that there is a certain percentage of people who just drop out of the program because they realize that this is not the job that I want, and I don't want to be investing in preparing for something that is not a really good fit for me. Now, once you have your high potentials split into the 4 categories, ready now, ready in 6 months, now you can be much more intentional around your focus of the intervention. So are you looking to develop them, or are you looking to retain them? And that's also going to influence the type of investment that you make. So our recommendation always is that folks who are ready now, they don't really need development. So they don't need the expensive executive coaching or action learning or leadership training or stretch assignments. Save those expensive interventions, the development interventions, for folks who are ready in 6 months. They're showing the most potential to actually be able to grow and develop. The ready now folks, there it's really about retention. So this is your holding group that is waiting for a position to open up. And some of the retention strategies, or some of the most effective retention strategies, are actually the least expensive. So such as increased visibility in the organization, so assigning them on highly visible projects, giving them more access to executives, giving them more freedom, flexibility in the role. So these are all things that are going to be retention strategies that are relatively low investment when you compare it to a comprehensive executive coaching program. And I always recommend to clients that your high potentials are really your people who are ready in 6 months. They have the high baseline of skills that are necessary for the next level up, and they are showing the most potential, the most growth potential in this area. So this is the group where you should be investing the expensive and very effective development interventions. So this is where the action learning, stretch assignments, executive coaching, leadership training should go. So those are the high potentials, truly. They have the baseline of skills, and they just need to be polished, because that's what essentially high potential development should be about. It should be about polishing skills, not developing skills from ground up. You cannot do that in 6 months or even 12 months. So you need to find people who have the baseline, and then you are just, through development opportunities, you are just polishing them. Christy, do you want to talk about how you brought up the idea of linking potential to strategy? And I find this a very important point. Do you want to talk about how we link potential to strategy here?
Sure. Thank you, Martin. I was actually going to mention, so when we're talking about the difference between, Martin started to get to really what are some of the qualities of high potentials, and so they have that baseline skill. And I would argue that the skill relevant to executing those strategies. So that was a great segue into this slide. So we think about, here at Pinsight, we think about potential as much more than current skills. So even if we're assessing a person for the next leadership level, there's certainly going to be still other factors that are going to influence their potential. So the past-looking approach of looking at previous performance is really not the best way to think about performance. So we consider 4 different factors for measuring potential here at Pinsight. The first is the person's current skill level. So we measure this through the simulation experience. We're able to have leaders or other individuals go through the simulation and really test drive what their current skills are, so that we know what that baseline is, where they're at currently. The second piece of this is motivation to apply those skills. So just because someone has a skill doesn't mean they're going to be motivated to apply it. And here we look at really the compatibility with their personality with the notion being that when a skill or a behavior is more compatible with an individual's personality, they'll be more motivated to display that skill, and they'll be more motivated to apply it consistently because it'll come much more naturally to them. The third factor here is the learning agility. So this is really looking at a person's orientation towards learning new skills and behaviors. And this comes from decades of research that suggests an individual's orientation towards learning something new is going to have a significant impact on both the rate at which they can acquire a new skill, as well as their motivation to do so, and then ultimately their ability to apply that skill. And then finally, we take into account the ease of development. So we know that not all skills are equal, that some skills are more difficult than others to learn, and that this is an important factor as well. So if we have two employees and one has a handful of skills that are all easy to develop and another has a handful of skills that are all difficult to develop, if we're not taking into account the ease of development, then we're going to be arriving at some poor estimates of how long it's going to take those people. So we factor this into considering how long it might take someone, if they're not currently ready, to develop the skills they need for executing that strategy. And that allows us to have these very tailored approaches of what bucket do they fall into. Are they ready now, in 6 months, 12 months, or not ready at this time? And that gives us a much better ability to link this to strategy and to provide an indication of how we can meet our strategic goals moving forward.
Great, thank you, Christy. So I'll show you actually a screenshot here from a sample project. So this is a screenshot directly from the Insight assessment. And what you can see, Christy mentioned this idea of potential for what, right? So in this particular example, let's say that we assessed 6 people who are individual contributors, and we want to know what is their potential to move into a frontline leadership position. And in this particular case, now we need to ask, well, potential for what? And in this case, let's say that the focus is on boosting innovation in the organization and increasing customer satisfaction. So those are the business priorities for this particular team or for the future managers. So we want to measure these 6 individual contributors against these standards. So what is their readiness? How quickly can they be ready to boost innovation on the team, increase customer satisfaction? So we ran them through a simulation-based assessment, and then from the assessment results, we see that we actually have 3 people right here, Jason, Victor, and Melissa, who are showing who are ready in 6 months. So they are showing the highest potential. So these are our high potentials here out of this group. And the assessment will reveal this to us in addition to what these individuals need to develop. So now when I run the needs analysis on these 3 individuals, you see that these are the 3 that I have selected. Now I have a curriculum here that I can put together. So I know when I run the needs analysis that all 3 of them struggle with customer focus, and 2 of them struggle with innovation and creating urgency. So these are the areas that I would then use as a blueprint to put the high potential program together. And I'm immediately tailoring it to Jason, Victor, and Melissa's needs. Because I have run them through an assessment, and now I know exactly what their gaps are, where their gaps are.
Martin, Christy? And then going back one slide, I was going to mention another piece of information here that directly relates to identifying potential is that ease of development. So not only do we know what their skill sets are, but we also know, based on this information, how easy or difficult those skills are going to be, so we can more accurately predict how much we need to invest and how much time we're going to have to spend on that.
Yes, that's a very good point. So the red ones, like innovation and creating urgency, we know from decades of research that these are not easy to develop, and they will take a long time. So when you have only a 3-month-long high potential program, it's probably not best use of your money to focus in these areas, because you're not going to see a big improvement here.
Great. So here we have the 70-20-10 principle, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with. This is kind of the golden rule in terms of how we want to develop employees. We want to be able to spend about 70% of that time practicing on the job, 20% on the coaching and mentoring, and then a very small portion on the actual courses and reading. However, the reality in most organizations is this is difficult to do. So it's difficult to structure on the job practice or deliberate practice, and it's difficult to supervise this as well. And so it ends up looking more like a 90-10, where we get about 90% of development occurring through those courses, reading, workshops, trainings, and then only about 10% practicing on the job, which may contribute to why we don't see more ROI on those high potential investments. So here on this next slide, we have what we call 5 minutes a day. So this is a notion that we subscribe to here at Pensight. And the idea is based on research that suggests after about 60 days or so of continuous practice that someone can really build a skill from the ground up, and that it not only can they build that skill, but that it becomes much more natural to them. So after practicing this just 5 minutes a day, every single day, that it becomes a natural part of their behavior, and it becomes something that they don't have to be so deliberate and conscious in trying to. So in this example, we have showing empathy, a behavior that I'm sure many leaders need to work on. And we have 3 different examples of what they could do just 5 minutes a day. So for example, name all the emotions you see in team members during a meeting and write them down. Something very simple, something very quick, that when someone starts doing that each day, they're going to be more cognizant of showing empathy in their daily functions. Or the second example here, look for one good news and help that person celebrate it. So congrats, you're a rock star. Tell me about how you accomplished that. Such a simple, simple thing to do that when we're reminded to do this on a daily basis, it, again, can really help us build that skill from the ground up.
Yeah, and Christy, as you mentioned, so this type of a development is based on the habit forming formula, and there's been a lot of buzz around how do you build habits, and that's what essentially leadership development or high potential development is about. It's about building correct habits, and when you set up the development in a way that gives people something very basic to practice every day, and 66 days later, it's automatic. You don't even think about it. You do it. It's natural part of your repertoire. So here, just to conclude, I know we want to save about 10 minutes for questions here. So this is what a powerful high potential program can actually look like. So you would start with nominations in the beginning. This example here is a 100-day, so 3-month program that we have implemented with some of our clients. And then if you are interested in the ROI statistics, we're happy to share those as well. But the focus of the entire program is on practice. So from day one, people are practicing leadership skills. So you start with nominations. Based on the nomination, then you run people through a simulation assessment, and the ones who are ready in 6 months, you select for this full program. During this simulation, so we utilize virtual simulations. These give practice opportunities to leaders. We use live simulations with live role players, so leaders really get an opportunity to coach an underperforming subordinate or have an interaction, a political interaction with a coworker. So we expose them to these challenging leadership situations, but that gives them an opportunity to practice from day one. But at the same time, it gives us an opportunity to watch them in action and accurately assess their strengths and development needs. Then the next step, we debrief this in a group setting. So we take the simulation apart, and through discussion, we engage leaders in peer learning. So they get an opportunity to share how they approach the different situations and what they got out of it. At the same time, they receive the assessment feedback. And then they receive individual feedback afterwards from their coaches. So this gives them an opportunity to process the feedback and then start identifying the 5 minutes a day exercises that they will put on their 100-day plan. And then for for the next 100 days, they meet as a group in action learning pods. So one week they meet as an action learning pod, and then next week they have individual coaching. And then you alternate. Week 1, action learning, week 2, individual coaching for the next 3 months. And during the action learning, each person identifies a special assignment, and the leaders help them to process through this assignment. So you get a lot of relationship building support, but then also individuals, the leaders, are learning some of the leadership skills. So questioning, giving feedback, active listening, and so forth. And then in the individual coaching session, the coach is increasing insight and reflection, coaching through any barriers that are surfacing, but also creating accountability. So it's constantly coming back to, how are your exercises coming? What did your assessment report say? Are you working on the appropriate leadership skills? And then 100 days later, we see that individuals make huge progress on their projects. And these projects or stretch assignments are then what they present. So we set up an event where we invite the executives and communicate achievements, celebrate the successes, but also help these high potentials to increase their visibilities. And then following the program, 6 months later or a year later, you reassess them. So you measure the improvement of skills. So we would put them through another simulation assessment, and this also gives you an opportunity to calculate the ROI of the program. So this is putting it all together what a sample high potential program could look like, that is very targeted to the individual needs, and then also focuses on the job practice and learning through practice rather than in workshops or in classroom or e-learning sessions. Good, so those are the slides that we have prepared, and we have about 9 minutes, well, 7 minutes to entertain your questions. Christy, do we have any questions?
We do have a few questions that came in. So going back to the previous slide, we had a question about in smaller organizations where maybe some upward career opportunities are not readily available, how would this program work? Would it still be an effective program in a smaller organization?
Yes, absolutely. So the purpose of the program is development. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you promise these individuals promotion. So it could be pitched as a professional development for them in smaller organizations, or it could be focusing on their lateral growth, so expanding their capabilities in the current role. So not necessarily upward movement.
Okay, great. Thank you, Martin.
That's a very good question.
Another question that came in, and you spoke to this a little bit at the beginning of the webinar, was how this might look for high potentials at different levels. So now that we're not just always focused on executives, how might these recommendations look for leaders at lower levels in the organization?
Yeah, the key difference is really going to be on the skills that you're focusing on. So obviously for individual contributors moving into frontline leadership positions, the focus of the assessment and the focus of the competencies that you are developing is different. So generally the first in the first transition, it's things like delegation, analytical thinking, consensus building, and that is critical for the leader. You move to the mid-level, and now the competencies become bigger. So when you are transitioning managers to mid-level leadership positions, now you are, changing into from, for instance, leading individuals to leading teams, because now they are responsible for whole intact teams, and it's a different set of competencies. And on the executive level, again, you get much higher competencies like entrepreneurship or, strategic thinking. So things that are that don't necessarily need to be fully developed for effective managers and mid-level leaders, but are critical, absolutely critical at the executive level. So the difference you'll find is in the scope of the competencies and the breadth of them.
Great, thank you, Martin. Another question that came in is, our company changes direction and strategies periodically. Would you have to have employees take it again to align the new strategies?
No, that's a very good question. So with our Pinside assessment, individuals are being assessed against all 8 strategies, and we find that 99% of organizations subscribe to a combination of these 8 key strategies. So the beauty of our reporting is that it's dynamic, it's interactive, so you assess people once, and then you can look at different combination of strategies as a lens to select high potentials and develop them.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question that came in was, this individual is wondering if you could speak to uncovering the mindset of this generation's high potentials. So what qualities or competencies are really describing high potentials today?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think this touches on the generational differences in the workforce, and there's a lot of buzz around that maybe today's high potentials are significantly different than the millennial high potentials, but are significantly different than Gen X, Gen Y, or the traditionalists. But when you so I'll answer this question from that perspective. So when you truly look at the research, individual differences between these generations are larger than the differences across generations. So a lot of so my interpretation of that research is that this the generational differences in the workforce is more of a myth than a reality, because at the end of the day, individuals are more different. So individual people are more different than the groups. The only difference that is supported by research is familiarity with technology, and that is something that we're developing millennials, especially, or younger high potentials, so Gen X, Gen Y. Those individuals will require almost a technology solution that is very well developed, resembles Facebook or LinkedIn, things that they are working with on a daily basis. They'll want something that's cool, and if you are working from PowerPoint and binders, it just or some PDF assessment reports, it's just not going to cut it for the younger generations.
Great. Thank you, Martin. And to add to that, I would say I second your interpretation of that research in terms of the individual differences being greater, and I think it really supports your point earlier about tailoring the program for the individual high potential, keeping in mind that the individual differences are going to be greater between people than necessarily generations, so that tailored approach is going to be critical with all generations, not just new generations.
Yeah, absolutely. Because at the end of the day, it's about developing, not masses, right? High potentials are the select few. It's maybe the 1% of the organization. So it's developing the hand-picked individuals, and it just doesn't make sense when you're hand-picking people that then you're putting them through a same curriculum. Once you are investing that much effort in them and that much money, you should be really tailoring it to what they actually need. So you are developing them to drive your business strategy moving forward.
Great. Well, thank you, Martin. That was all the questions we had that came in, and we're just a minute short of concluding the webinar. So unless there's any further concluding remarks that you have, Martin, I think we are set to wrap up.
Good. So I want to echo the 2 take-home messages from today's webinar that we find through our research and experience. Number 1 is make sure that you have the right people in there, because that is what can make or break a high potential program. If you are starting with the wrong people, no matter how powerful your executive coaching is or how much money you are spending on classes and workshops, you are not going to see a big ROI. So that's the first point. And then second point, if you're handpicking these people and they are truly your 1% in the organization, then do tailor the development program to what they actually need.
Great. Well, thank you for summarizing the key points again, and thank you to everyone for joining our webinar today. If you would like more information on any of this, please feel free to reach out to either Martin or myself. You can see both of our email addresses are here on the page.
And we do have a quick 3-question survey as soon as you log out of this webinar. And there's also an opportunity to see a demo of BinSight or schedule it of the assessment. So if you're interested, please take a moment and fill out the survey. We really appreciate your feedback. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.